You're now listening to Syrian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
Good morning, this is Arlene and you're listening to Syrian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today we are going to talk about ISIS and its global war game. We have here Mouaz Moustafa, Executive Director of Syrian Emergency Task Force, and together with us is also Salem, Ghandour, advisors to the Syrian Emergency Task Force. First of all, welcome to the studio and thanks for joining our discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So, Mouaz, you're all the way from the US, and of course, Salem is here with us joining in the studio. Perhaps both of you can give a bit of a background on what is the Syrian Emergency Task Force and what do you do exactly? You can start with Mouaz.
Yeah, no problem. So the Syrian Emergency Task Force is an American non-profit organization that was established a month after the beginning of the Syrian Revolution. It was established in April of 2011. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we have offices on the border of Syria and Turkey, one in Gaziantep and one in Antakya. We also have 4 offices inside the war-torn country, 2 in Idlib province, 1 in Aleppo province, and 1 in northern Latakia province, and areas that are liberated from the regime in ISIS and are contested at times, and unfortunately under constant bombardment. And our organization really focuses on humanitarian aid to those that are internally displaced. You have about 8.5 million Syrian internally displaced refugees. These are not the ones that have made it to Turkey and Jordan and in Europe and other places yet. We also implement and work with Western governments like the United States, United Kingdom, among others, in providing and supporting civilian governing structures that are rising up in these liberated areas and countering violent extremism, countering the Assad regime. And we also do a lot of work in terms of documentation of crimes that happen in Syria, things like torture in prisons, where just recently the Human Rights Watch has published a report that we work very closely with them on almost 55,000 pictures of men, women, and children that were tortured to death. Mm-hmm. And finally, we do political advocacy, where we try to move the United States, Europe, countries in different parts of the world to have a better stance on Syria, so we can defeat the forces of evil there that include terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, ISIS, and also things like the Assad regime that's been killing its people for the past 4.5 years.
So you are actually working together with governments in Europe and the US.
Absolutely, that's right. We implement for the State Department. We work closely with the Department of Defense. We work with the United Kingdom's Foreign Ministry, Foreign Commonwealth Office, and we work with the French and Italians as well on providing support to the inside.
Mm-hmm. Salem, and you are also an advisor for the Syrian Emergency Task Force. What do you do?
Sure, Arlene. Really, my role, Arlene, comes into how Mouaz can expand his advocacy efforts, specifically in Southeast Asia. I think it's been fascinating over the past few years to see how ISIS has managed to find recruits in the region. And I also find it fascinating to see how the Syrian conflict has spilled all the way to Southeast Asia. Currently, unofficially, according to Syrians on the ground in Malaysia, there are approximately between 30 to 50,000 Syrian refugees in Malaysia. We've also heard, unfortunately, of Malaysians joining ISIS or pledging to ISIS. So very much the Syrian conflict has affected Southeast Asia, specifically Malaysia, Indonesia, and certain parts of the Philippines. So what we're trying to do now is also working with governments in the region in, number one, as Mouaz said, taking a stronger stance vis-a-vis the Syrian conflict and how to have a more sustainable solution. All right. So that's on the policy level. The second level really is about mindset. How can governments counter that toxic ideology? And there are various ways of doing so. And finally, from a funding perspective and a humanitarian perspective, how can governments in the region also assist in absorbing refugees and providing them with a little bit more dignity and humanity and saving them from Syria, really. So those are, at least personally here, this is what my scope of work would be, and feeding this back to the SETF.
Are you working closely with the Malaysian government or government in Southeast Asia?
Directly with the Malaysian government, no. To be frank, we've had some positive encounters with them yet. We've also been talking to the Indonesian and Filipino governments, certain agencies and certain offices. And I think there is reception to the message. There is urgency towards resolving the Syrian crisis. But at the same time, I think there is generally fear of getting too involved. It has become, and I'm sure Mouaz will explain to you later, how multifaceted and deep and complex the conflict has become because of a lack of willingness in the international community. But I'll leave this to Mouaz. But we certainly hope that ASEAN, which is hungry for leadership, hungry for, if I may say, foreign policy power projection, I think being more involved in the Syrian conflict, offering a peaceful resolution to it, and having a more proactive humanitarian role will only help ASEAN into growing into a more cohesive and impactful organization globally.
We'll talk more about Southeast Asia later on in the segment, but let's focus on the crux of the problem, which is ISIS right now. How does your organization deal with the crisis in relation with ISIS?
Sure. It's what's very sad is to watch what started out as a revolution calling for dignity, democracy, freedom, really universal human rights and dignity to be afforded to a population. And what resulted for 9 months of peaceful, nonviolent protests were that bare chests were met with bullets. Activists and protesters and civilians were being unlawfully arrested, many tortured to death, and hundreds of thousands remain in jails. And as the situation continued, and as Salem mentioned, with the sort of lack of action by the world to protect civilians, we ended up with a situation where a vacuum was filled by a horrendous virus, which is ISIS. And the Syrian people are really stuck between two horrible enemies. To give you an example, the Syrian Emergency Task Force, as I mentioned, we have our field team where I just came back from the region. We're regularly back and forth. And two of our young men, a 23 and a 24-year-old, amazing activists, were taken by the regime. They were tortured to death. Two other members of our staff, a 25-year-old and a 29-year-old, so talented, were working on starting democratic elections in towns that were liberated. They were kidnapped by ISIS and beheaded.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yes, and what is so shocking about it, as a matter of fact, we leave all their stuff on their desks. We have not moved it just to remind us every day of what the Syrian people suffer. But that's really a small example of what Syrians face. We are fighting a two-front war. One against a horrendous regime, a dictatorship that has killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands, remains the number one killer of civilians and number one reason really for refugees. And two, by this new entity that wants to erase Syria from the map and wants to establish what they call their Islamic State. And are really, again, sort of foreigners that have come into Syria and are plundering the country. And so in order, what we need to do is we need to defeat both of these enemies, and the strategy must be simultaneous against both, because Assad is really a magnet and an incubator of ISIS in the sense that he helps them recruit. He's the perfect thing for propaganda by ISIS to say, look, no one's here to help, no one's here to fight Assad. At the same time, both ISIS and Assad have a mutual interest in defeating their number one threat. And their number one threat are the Syrian people, the people that are fighting every day for their country to be independent and to go back to its own citizens, and that's been really the most difficult thing to see. That we need to understand that, number one, there needs to be protection of civilians, and the protection of civilians itself will lead to advancements both against ISIL and helping Syria transition into a path towards democracy.
Yeah. I want to understand further on the Syrian crisis. Do you think that the fall of Assad means the demise of ISIS?
I believe that the fall of Assad absolutely means the demise of ISIS, but not only that, it means the stop of the bleeding of Syria and a major halt to the flow of hundreds and thousands, millions of refugees that are leaving the country. I can tell you, for example, if you were to stop, 9 out of 10 refugees and ask them, why did you leave? Why are you here? They will tell you, we left because barrel bombs were falling on our homes. We left because aerial attacks were ongoing. And that's why people are forced to leave. None of these people are leaving for better economic conditions. They're not leaving for better health insurance or lower taxes. These people are leaving because they're being faced with this bombardment. Now, the reason that I say it spells the demise of ISIS is because the people that have fought ISIS so effectively and have defeated it have been the Syrian moderate opposition. In Idlib province, ISIS was cleared out, completely decimated in 1 week. In Aleppo province, where ISIS was well entrenched, it took less than 27 days for the Syrian people to defeat and clear out ISIS out of that province. All the while, these two provinces remain under constant bombardment by Russia, by the dictatorship in Syria, by the Assad regime, and they remain targets. And the question is, how can we continuously allow civilians and opposition elements that are not only fighting ISIS but very effective at defeating ISIS to be bombed by the Assad regime and expect that we can defeat ISIS without a ground force that's able to clear them out and that's also has the support of the indigenous populations, which is really key. And one thing to remember, less than 10% of ISIS is actually Syrian. ISIS itself is made up of mostly Iraqis, but also foreign fighters from Saudi Arabia and other countries, and also foreign fighters from Europe and from Asia.
So it's a global war by a global organization in this case, because majority of them are all over the world, including Southeast Asia, some of the members.
Absolutely. I can tell you one of the because we have networks even in Raqqa and other places where ISIS is holding control, we have a lot of access to sort of try to figure out ISIL movements and try to help support efforts against them. And there are some people from Southeast Asia that are playing key roles, especially in terms of helping produce the propaganda videos that are coming out. And ISIL is using the misery in Syria to attract those people that are either misled, disaffected, and to bring them into what they're calling, again, their Islamic State, which is really, a false symbol for what some people are tricked by. So it absolutely has global reach. And the longer we stay and the longer we don't address the main cause of ISIL, which is the death of civilians at the hands of the Assad regime, the more that ISIL will continue to grow and become a real global threat, much bigger than it is right now.
Yep. Anyway, we'll take a short break. When we return, we'll discuss further on ISIS and its global wargame.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
from Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene. You're back with me again on our Durian ASEAN discussion today on the ISIS and its global war game. We have Mouaz, Moustafa and Salem, Ghandour. Both of them are from the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Early on, we discussed a lot about your organization and the situation on the ground when it comes to ISIS. But I want to know, why ISIS seems to be so undefeated despite all the air drones, military offensive, and the commitments by governments all over the world to halt terrorism. Probably I want to ask Salem first, because you have been working closely with the people in Southeast Asia.
I think from my perspective, Arlene, with regards to Southeast Asia, I agree with you that the propaganda machine and the ideology, unfortunately, keeps winning people on the ground in Southeast Asia. However, I think I am personally comforted by the fact that the previous ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur just a few weeks ago has actually made a statement. ASEAN has taken a strong stance against ISIS, against the propaganda. Unfortunately, the statement was a little bit empty on how it plans to counter that ideology. But as I said,
it's too ambitious, is it?
I don't think it's too ambitious, but with every policy or every statement, there has to be a mechanism on how you want to deal with the issue.
And is that one of the things that ASEAN lacks, which is having a policy backup to whatever commitments that it share on ASEAN summit?
Absolutely. I think, look, ASEAN generally, and now we're digressing a little bit on a different subject on ASEAN, I think generally speaking, the statement on ISIS is probably symptomatic of what you generally see in ASEAN is, of course, a wonderful idea, a great ambition, and something Southeast Asia has to work towards, but again, always thin on mechanics, always thin on implementation. With regards to ASEAN's statement on ISIS, again, this is something we should all support. We should be happy that governments in the region are taking a stronger stance against ISIS. However, I'd like, to see again details, more specifically, which agencies are going to deal with ISIS.
Actually, I want to add one more question, because we all know what is terrorism. I mean, we were watching live, I mean, at least for me, during the 9/11, at the bomb of the Twin Tower. But when it comes to ISIS, I think a lot of people might not realize it's a completely different ball game. Do you think governments in Southeast Asia or globally, they understand what kind of terrorism that ISIS is bringing forth to the world?
I think they understand, but they understand a little bit too late. As Mouaz earlier said, you have to bear in mind that ISIS grew through a vacuum. There was lack of commitment from the international community in dealing with the Syrian crisis. Groups like ISIS bred through the desperation and the poverty that war has created. And despite those warning signs, and Mouaz again can expand on that later, there still was reticence from intervention in dealing with the Syrian crisis, and now it has mothballed into something tentacular, which has presence in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. As you can see from the Paris attacks, those are homegrown terrorists that have pledged allegiance to a group that's based in Raqqa. I think what Southeast Asia has to effectively do, number one, is of course, who is going to deal with this? Since we're talking about a regional solution, does ASEAN actually have the mandate to deal with ISIS? I don't think so. But the good thing that ASEAN has done is it has reminded governments in the region to deal with the ISIS problem. But again, what saddens me most, Arlene, and Mouaz has highlighted this so effectively, yes, we want to deal with ISIS, but we are still scoffing over the main issue and the core of ISIS, the cause of ISIS, which is the Syrian conflict and the Assad regime. So when we heard Prime Minister Najib going to United Nations pledging to take in refugees, this is actually an indirect but effective step to stem the conflict in Syria. But what we have to see now is also Malaysia, Indonesia, and ASEAN generally taking also a more proactive step in condemning the violence in Syria, not only committed and perpetrated by ISIS, but the violence committed and perpetrated by the Assad regime and the Syrian government. Those are jointly together providing and giving fodder to ISIS. I'm sure that ISIS, even in Southeast Asia now, is extracting a lot of its strength and a lot of its propaganda from the desolate scenes of desperation, of destruction that you see in Syria. So yes, you can try and choke ISIS off domestically in Malaysia or Indonesia through security measures, through funding, through re-education, rehabilitation. But again, you are not dealing with a primary source of what is feeding ISIS, which is unspeakable violence in Syria. So one more charter or one more statement I would have liked to see in ASEAN in condemning ISIS, it's also condemning the violence and the dictatorship and the Russian intervention in Syria, which ultimately is feeding ISIS in Southeast Asia.
And another thing, when it comes to Mouaz, you're working closely in Washington. Do you think that government in the US, they are working not just on the offensive side in the military? Are they really working on the strategy part to defeat ISIS?
So that's a great question. And to tell you the truth, the problem with the United States' approach to Syria was that the White House had a policy of non-intervention whatsoever. I'm not talking just militarily, but absolutely, staying away as much as possible from what's going on in Syria, including ignoring horrendous crimes and lowering the U.S.'s credibility when it comes to its own rules that it sets. So, for example, when President Obama said that if Assad uses chemical weapons, that's a red line for us and we're going to react. And then when Assad used chemical weapons, killing 1,400 or more civilians, many children, Obama administration was desperate to find a way out of taking any limited action against the Assad regime, which, by the way, would have paved the way for a political solution because the Assad regime would have seen that, he doesn't have a blank check to murder his own people. And as a result of, again, that lack of action, we're in the situation that we're in now. The United States continues to be, under this administration, very much unwilling to commit to greater intervention in Syria in any way.
So in other words, there's no strategy at all. It's just a reaction towards whatever that is happening right now, and then the US will be making a move.
That's a perfect way of saying it. It's been a reactive strategy to where the US and the White House is doing what they believe is, they have to do this as a political reaction because they will get in trouble for it. Now, in terms of strategy, though, if you talk to people within the Department of Defense, people in Congress, and Salem has been to many meetings here in Washington on this. They will tell you that they get it, and they do understand there needs to be an overall strategy. And the key part of the strategy is that there needs to be a ground force that beats ISIS. You said earlier, all the world is bombing and everything like that, yet ISIS seems to continue to win, continue to grow. Well, that's true because you need a ground component. Now, the ground component shouldn't be foreign troops because ISIS itself wants to drag American troops and Western troops in because they can recruit more. But it needs to be Muslims, Syrians on the ground that when they fight against ISIL actually has less ability to recruit. If the Iranians or the Assad regime or the Russians or the Americans on the ground kill someone from ISIL recruits 100 more. But if someone from the village that ISIL is occupying fights back, ISIL actually loses some of its own membership because they see that ISIS is out there killing fellow Muslims and so on. So in order to achieve that ground component, we need to empower the Syrian opposition, which is fighting a two-front war against the dictatorship and against ISIS. And that will lead us to seeing a real shrinking of ISIL territory, which will right away signal, the sort of hurt their recruitment efforts and propaganda efforts. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very important thing that many in the U.S. government understand, but they can't move on it because the White House, unfortunately, has decided that they want to leave this problem for the next administration.
I want to pose this question to both of you, which is about how ISIS is so successful at recruiting young people, both men and women, to fight for their cause. In your opinion, why is this happening? I mean, of course, President Obama said they have amazing social media skills, and for FBI and CIA directors, they would say that is a revolutionary by using ideology to influence people to fight on behalf of ISIS. But do you think there's more than that?
Let me give you an example. If I am ISIS and I'm trying to recruit someone, I would say the following. Number one, I would show them one of the thousands and thousands of videos of barrel bombs. These are crude bombs of TNT shrapnel in a big barrel that drop on civilian populations, killing children and women and civilians and young men. I would show them pictures of people that are being tortured to death in Assad jails every day, of, again, the most vulnerable, innocent people. And I would show that to someone in Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines and say, look what's going on. No one's doing anything against this. Come join us and fight this evil. And when they question me about, oh, but you guys are evil and so on, I will say, how can we be evil? We're being bombed by every country in the world, and we're still growing. It means, God's with us and we're doing the right fight. So all of the propaganda that ISIS needs, the world and the dictatorship and the Assad regime has supplied. And by the world being quiet about these atrocities and by, seeing this, it's really easy to convince someone who doesn't know all the facts that they need to come join our fight. But once they come to join ISIL, only then, and it's too late, they will realize that they're actually fighting against other Muslims, that they're actually very limited front lines with the Assad regime, and that they're serving this terrorist organization.
But, I have to stop you here because some of them are not, some uneducated young or naive young people. Some of them are from very educated background, middle class.
Allow me to jump in, Arlene, here. I think we are, and I think Mouaz has highlighted the issue, and of course we're going to agree. We're not here to debate, but I think people are still underestimating, Arlene, the gravity of the Syrian crisis. I think it's been said on, and unfortunately not highlighted enough, that this is by far the biggest humanitarian tragedy that the world has seen since probably World War II. Arlene, we are talking about, including internally and externally displaced, about almost 12 million refugees. This is an unspeakable number. We're talking about around 300,000 dead, over 500,000 jailed, and God knows how many more people maimed and injured by the conflict. So, as Mouaz said, for people who are actually paying close attention to the Syrian conflict, the propaganda is there. Frankly speaking, there's nothing revolutionary in the way ISIS is actually hiring people. What is revolutionary is the amount of unspeakable violence and the way the international community has been, frankly speaking, unwilling to engage in a new war. Unfortunately, we are in a time of economic crisis. Europe is struggling. We're talking about Brexit, and we're talking about Grexit, and then we were talking about the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain who are suffering, and France that's unable to close its economic deficit. So of course you have an unwillingness. Unfortunately, the timing of this crisis is just terrible, because you have an economic crisis, you have an unemployment crisis, you have a sovereign financial crisis in Europe, and so you've had a timing where the Syrian conflict has managed to unfortunately go under the radar most of the time. But if you're in, as you said, Arlene, middle class, educated. Unfortunately, some people fall into the trap. I still feel that
you could be. I'm sorry to interrupt. You could be educated. You could be, graduated from the top schools, and you're very smart. It's not a matter, I think, of education as much as the matter of people see these horrendous things happening and they want to do something to help. And the message is no one else in the world is doing something to help. What they're not educated about is the fact that the ISIL itself is not fighting the Assad regime. That ISIL itself is fighting those people suffering under the Assad regime. And that's hard to know without being on the ground.
And by the way, Arlene, there has been extensive coverage in French media, specifically Le Monde, on returning ISIS fighters, French ISIS fighters who left. Now, of course, many people get worked up when they see the violence in Syria. And of course, most of the foreigners who go there, we have to realize, are actually stuck there. ISIS holds them back. They'll be killed if they run away. And ultimately, they also get carried away in all the violence that's happening. So, I would urge most people, unfortunately, the newspaper is only published in French, but the research that France has put into investigating returning ISIS fighters who re-reform themselves, I assume, have also been very disillusioned by what ISIS is doing, which is plunder, murder, and genocide to a certain extent. So it's a trap. Ultimately, I don't think anyone will join ISIS and be very happy about it. But yeah, that's the issue. I think it's actually dealing with the Syrian crisis. And again, Arlene, Iraq was first bombed in 2003.
That's quite some time ago.
Yeah. The Iraqi war was at the forefront of news media until 2005. From 2005 to 2015, Arlene, no one has actually... Just hang up. It's okay, hang up. Arlene, actually, nobody has covered... Oh, you want me
Continue
to
again, yeah.
No one has actually extensively covered what happened in Iraq between 2005 and 2015. And again, there was another vacuum there, the issues with Iranian interventionism and the issues that the Maliki government had created in dividing society amongst ethnic and religious lines, notably the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds. So those are all issues. I think it's about misinformation as well, generally speaking.
Yeah. Very interesting. Anyway, we'll take another short break. When we return, we'll discuss further, especially on the refugee side of the crisis.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
From Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene. You're back with me again on the Durian ASEAN discussion today on ISIS global war game. Of course, we had an extensive discussion on the first two segments with Mouaz, Moustafa and Salem, Ghandour, both from the Syrian Emergency Task Force regarding on ISIS and the Syrian conflict. Moving forward, I think before we discuss on what kind of strategy that the US and ASEAN can adopt in order for them to both defeat ISIS and end the Syrian crisis, I think the most important thing that the global world is facing right now is the influx of Syrian refugees, and it has become such a global crisis that every major conferences in Europe, ASEAN, and in the US, governments are voicing out either against or absorbing all these Syrian refugees, including in Southeast Asia. Right now, we are seeing Malaysian government pledging to take in 3,000 Syrian refugees, and the same goes with governments in different countries all over the world. I want to pose this question to both of you. What do you think? What is your take out on the global refugee crisis that is happening right now?
Just to give quickly a recap of the numbers, 4 million that are outside and around Syria in camps. These are all potential refugees that will travel towards Europe and elsewhere. More significantly, 8.5 million internally displaced under constant bombardment now by the Russians as well, that are escaping this bombardment, and again will look, they can't even be absorbed by the neighboring countries, so they look otherwise, Europe, United States, Southeast Asia and other places to go for refuge and start a new life, unfortunately for them, outside their home.
So right now in the Middle East is filled with Syrian refugees, the Middle East. Absolutely. Jordan, for example, has a refugee camp called Az-Za'atari refugee camp. We were just there, and it is now Jordan's fourth biggest city. So you can imagine this is something that didn't exist 3.5-4 years ago, and is now literally the fourth biggest city in Jordan. Syrian refugees there almost make a third of the population. In Lebanon, there are no camps, but you have over 1 million Syrian refugees that are living whichever way they can, absorbed by the population. In Turkey, you have hundreds of thousands in camps and over 1 million, including people that are unregistered. So yes, that's just in the neighboring countries that cannot sustain, by the way, these populations, and the refugee flow continues. Because the violence and specifically the aerial bombardment of civilian populations continues. And what about your take on this, Salem?
Sure. With regards to ASEAN and specifically Malaysia in this context, Arlene, So far, Malaysia is the only country in ASEAN that has decided to embark on an official refugee absorption program. And the Prime Minister pledged in New York that he would take in 3,000 refugees. Of course, that's a positive step forward. There's very little to fault that move. But what I'm more worried about, Arlene, is long-term. Number one, Malaysia is not a signatory of the UN Convention on Refugees. So, number one, how are those refugees going to come in? What is the long-term plan for them? How are you going to absorb them? You see, in Europe, the refugee crisis, Arlene, is an issue because down the road, those refugees are actually going to be regularized. So some of them are either going to become citizen or their children will become citizens. So we're talking about a one-time absorption. In Malaysia, I think we're still on details of what's going to happen to the refugees. Are you going to keep them here for 2 years, for 5 years, until the crisis ends? Are you going to give them a permanent residency? Are you going to make them citizens? And those are critical questions, especially in a country where refugees are not allowed to work and don't have access to public education. So I think it's a positive first step, but Malaysia has to work on an ecosystem. I think just a few weeks ago, Malaysia welcomed the first 2 or 3 refugee families. The few of them are going to stay in Malaysia on student visas, and some other ones are going to be dependents from family members who are already employed in Malaysia. Now, as you can see, this is an unsustainable solution for a large number of refugees. So I think we welcome a discussion with the Malaysian government to see what policies we can formulate for a long-term absorption of Syrian refugees. And I think more worrying to me, Arlene, is there are currently, as I said earlier, between 30 to 50,000 Syrians in Malaysia. Most of them have overstayed their visas. A little more detail. I think, Arlene, the best example we can look at is the role Malaysia played during the Bosnian War in the early 90s. Back then, when Malaysia absorbed Bosnian refugees, there was a very clear policy, or at least a very clear target. Scholarship funds were set up for Bosnian students to study notably at the
Islamic University of Malaysia.
Islamic University of Malaysia, that's correct. So there was a target, there were scholarship funds that were set up. I don't think there was a cap on the number of students, but there was a target. And we're going to take them in as students. Hopefully by the time they graduate with a bachelor's or a master's, the war will be over. But at least I think the policy was very clear. This is a short-term stopgap measure. But the impact of that policy, Arlene, if you're looking out 20 years down the road, Malaysia still has has a very special place in the heart of many Bosnian people because of what Malaysia had done and what had sincerely done. So I certainly hope that right now Malaysia, I think, has taken a very positive first step in taking in refugees, but I think now it's all about really angling the policy and who are we going to target in Syria, how are we going to do it, and how many. But I think it's probably unfair to Syrian refugees to take them in without managing their expectations as well.
It's important to look after their welfare. It's not just for the sake of taking them in as refugees. Talking about that, I think I want to move on to what can the world do? As I think in this case, what can ASEAN do and what can the US do to at least, the least they can do is to lessen the crisis that is happening there, and eventually, if there's a possibility, create a democratic platform for Syrian people to be able to come back and live peacefully. Do you think there's a way for it?
Absolutely. So, as much as there could be accommodations for refugees, the world is struggling with the few million that they're dealing with now. We have 12 million, over 12 million. The world cannot absorb 12 million. So, just imagine, 3,000 is what Malaysia has agreed to. That's 0.00001%, if that, of this entire population of 12 million people. So the question isn't absorb refugees, it should be help them stay home. And the way we do that is by providing them with a safe zone, a protected zone, a no-fly zone, whatever you want to call it, but making sure that the areas where you have the vast majority of internally displaced refugees is no longer under constant aerial attack and bombardment. And so what the United States can do is impose a safe zone for Syrians that are still inside the country, that don't want to leave the country unless they're absolutely forced to by this horrific bombing. And by doing so, we are stemming the flow of refugees, and that alone is the big solution for it. But we are also countering ISIL propaganda. We are also providing a safe place where we can nurture the foundations of a democratic Syria in the future. And it also allows the Syrian people the place in which they can fight back against ISIS without being bombed by Assad.
So right now you are supporting for greater U.S. involvement, but didn't U.S. has been been to the Middle East and create too many wars? Do you think more U.S. involvement is a good idea?
I am against U.S. involvement 99% of the time, and whenever we invade a country because we make up evidence like we did in Iraq. Or other occasions, that's something that is wrong, and it's something that has led us to where we are now. A big part of ISIS is from Iraq, and a big part of ISIS is the Iraqi army that was sort of decommissioned and told to go away. And so that's definitely a problem. But when you have an indigenous population calling for its human rights, and then we see this population killed, genocidal massacres committed against it, it is the United Nations' job to step in, like it did in Bosnia, like it did in Kosovo, and prevent this from happening, because when you don't prevent these mass atrocities from happening, you end up with horrible never-again moments, whether that be like Rwanda or other areas. So what we're asking for the U.S. isn't to invade Syria, isn't to send ground troops, it is simply to stop aerial bombardment of the Assad regime and the Russians and others.
They should play the role as a peacekeeper rather than, more military offenses.
All the United States has to do is say that the U.S. establishes a safe zone over this area, which is Aleppo and Idlib and these other areas, and the U.S. to say if anybody goes against this no-fly zone, then they may get shot down, essentially. Okay. We need the credible threat of force, but not really the use of force. And when the U.S. does that, you end up with a safe zone, and you end up with a whole different situation and dynamic on the ground, including no more refugees.
Okay. And what about in Southeast Asia?
Sure. I think, Arlene, the beautiful thing about Southeast Asia is there always has been a tradition and a history of welcoming migrants, specifically, in Malaysia. Indonesia, Philippines, right? People coming back and forth, trading, and this ultimately is what built the fabric of
the land of a melting pot.
absolutely, and I think to ask for ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries to, be militarily involved is, of course, a tall order and probably something I would not welcome. But I think the role that ASEAN can play is to stick to its, in a sense, historical values and ethics in welcoming refugees. But I think that policy has to be very targeted. One, of course, absorbing as many as possible. Southeast Asia is still a place where we have strong pockets of poverty and issues in socioeconomic developments, but of course we would like to see more Syrian refugees here. But I think as ASEAN grows and as ASEAN becomes a more manufacturing-based economy, financial and services-based economy, absorbing refugees by giving them skills, training, and of course, having them also, in a sense, fall in love with the region so that when they go back to their home country in Syria, we can build stronger economic and trade ties with the Middle East. So
you're looking at the very long term in a sense that creating bilateral ties between
it has to be
the population there.
Absolutely, it has to be, and this has done before, as I said, with Bosnia and Malaysia, and what the Philippines has also done with Vietnam. As you recall, one of the first countries to welcome Vietnamese refugees during the Vietnam War was the Philippines, and they absorbed many of them. And they welcomed them, they absorbed them into society, and ultimately went back home. And if you look at trade between the Philippines and Vietnam, it's very vibrant, especially on the SME level. The refugees who spent time in the Philippines, who were welcomed there, who were safe there, will not forget what the Philippines has done to them. Similarly, if you look at Bosnia and Malaysia, The relationship, yes, from a trade perspective is negligible, again, because of geographic constraints and Bosnia being surrounded by the European Union, which is their main market. But again, Malaysia still plays a very how can I say, emotive role in Bosnia.
Soft power in a sense.
Absolutely. It's all about soft power, and I think we can do the same thing again, not only with Syria, but through the Middle East, the Levant. We're talking about Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Egypt will all appreciate the role that ASEAN would play in welcoming Syrian refugees, training them, giving them skills, safe haven, and preparing them for a new Syria to be built, ultimately.
I wanna add to this, if you don't mind, just really quickly, because I think Salem makes a really good point. The fact is that Malaysia has had a special relationship. The Syrian people and the Malaysian people are close. For a long time, you don't need a visa to go to Malaysia. They're both Muslim countries. There's a lot of admiration in both directions. And if there must be an establishment of relationships, by the way, with the opposition, forget the opposition, with the civilian councils, with the people that are ruling the cities and provinces that are no longer under the Assad regime. And establishing those, Syria will have to be rebuilt. Everybody in the region, the Saudis and the Qataris, the Americans, the Europeans, all have an interest in making sure Syria is rebuilt so it doesn't fall to the hands of extremists or other things. And the best people that would be accepted to take on that role in helping develop it, which is a very smart investment on the Malaysian side and which will be able to use money from donors from other countries, is Malaysia itself. So there's a real opportunity there in growing this forward. I mean, I was on the border and I called Salem. We talked. I was with a couple of refugees, Brahimi and Hashim, and both were talking about how much they love Malaysians and stuff like that. And it's really powerful to see, the potential there. That Malaysia is seen as a sister country. The people share the same religion and so on. And I think that's something that's very powerful. And so far, I got to admit, the Syrian people somewhat feel deserted because there is no official stance on the atrocities being committed against them by the Malaysian government. And we encourage that. We encourage to at least start a relationship with the Syrian people that are fighting for their freedom against a global threat like ISIL and against a threat against humanity like Assad.
Yeah.
And we've heard also, Arlene, just to add very quickly, I know we're reaching the time limits of this interview, but also former military generals in the U.S., General D.S. Malone and many more, have said that they would like to see moderate Muslim countries play a more active role in the conflict.
And of course, this falls with Malaysia.
Absolutely. I think Malaysia has challenged itself to be a champion of moderate Islam, and I think the Syrian conflict would be the perfect case study, right? So away now with the theories of how you would like to do it and what you want to be. Syria is a perfect case study of how Malaysia can anchor and pivot itself effectively as that moderate Muslim country.
Interesting, and completely agree with that. Anyway, we are towards the end of our show, and thanks for sharing your views on this very interesting topic, and of course the topic that the world is definitely talking lively right now. And with that, thank you very much, Mouaz, Moustafa and Salem Ghandour.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.